on placement on MassDEP's website. The presentation will be up there for folks to listen to after the call. So good afternoon and welcome to MassDEP's first technical session this week on the Massachusetts Clean Heat Standard. My name is Christine Kirby. I am MassDEP's Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Air and Waste. Joining me today from the agency are Will Space, Emily Lamb, and Josh Cook of BAW's Climate Strategies Group. Next slide, please. Many of you may have joined us on one of our virtual community meetings last Monday. This week, we are holding 3 technical sessions on the Clean Heat Standard, and we will cover 6 topics. For today, we will cover compliance flexibilities we are building into the program, including alternative compliance payments. And these are often referred to as ACPs when discussed. We will hold 2 other sessions on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week on the topics listed on this slide. We are very much interested in and encourage your feedback on what we are covering today, and also encourage any comments going forward. Comments may be submitted to MassDEP's Climate Strategies email box, and that's climate.strategies@mass.gov. You will see that at the end of the presentation on the slide, which was also up on our website. I'm now going to turn it to Emily to cover our meeting logistics. Emily?
Sure, yes. So as Christine mentioned, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our website. To minimize background noise, all of the attendees are on mute. We'd ask that you enter your name and affiliation if relevant. Participants panel, so you can find that by clicking on the participants, and then there's an option to rename next to your name in the list that pops up. Next slide. So there will be opportunities for your questions and comments in this session. So we'd ask that if you would like to ask a question or provide a comment, you use the raise your hand function, which you can find in the participants panel in the bottom of that box that pops up. When it's your turn, we'll notify you and announce your name, and you can unmute yourself to speak. If you don't want to speak, you can also submit questions through the question and answer box. And with that, I will turn it back to Christine.
Great, next slide, please. Thank you, Emily. For our topics today, the agenda for parts 1 and 2 is to provide some background on the issue, also a summary of comments received, and as Emily said, to leave time for your questions and comments. I will now turn it over to Will Space. Will?
Great, thanks, Christine. Next slide. So I'm going to go through a few slides here covering some of the material that we've already put out on the topic of the topics we're looking at today in our various documents, including the Clean Heat Commission reports, the climate plans, the discussion document we published, and I'll be going back and forth a little bit with Emily to help you sort of keep track of what we're up to. When I speak, it'll be about something that we've put out there, and then Emily's going to work on kind of summarizing what we've already heard in the comments on a topic. And really the idea of this meeting isn't for us to go much past what we've said and what we've heard, but just to give some opportunity for discussion and back and forth on where we are now, maybe to craft more technical comments on some of these topics. So just very briefly, we're going to do this kind of at the beginning of each meeting, a reminder of what we're talking about when we say Clean Heat Standard. We're talking about a regulation. It's a regulation that applies to heating energy suppliers. Certainly that includes propane, natural gas, heating oil, may also include electricity, either at the beginning or at some point. And the requirement is to reduce emissions by implementing clean heat. And we would do that using clean heat credits. Clean heat credits are kind of the idea that for a requirement, you need to have something really specific that you can kind of count to make it into a standard, which is what we're doing here. And so we will use the credit process to sort of keep track of the different kinds of actions that are happening and facilitate compliance and the mechanics of the system. Next slide. So we did, in our discussion document, include some information about compliance flexibility mechanisms. We pointed out that the use of these credits does provide some flexibility within the system, because it allows the ability to create reductions in different ways and also to trade them among parties. So the system, the idea of a standard of this type is that it's inherently flexible because of the crediting mechanism. But many crediting mechanisms, including most likely this one, include other flexibility mechanisms to address the things that may change the demand for clean heat or some part of the program, like weather, and to limit compliance obligation costs. So the options that we floated in a discussion document, the first one is the alternative compliance payments, and that's kind of the one that has gotten the most attention and I'll spend the most time on. But we also had another one related to the kind of crediting concept, which is the idea of transferring not just credits, but the compliance obligation among different parties. We didn't say a whole lot of that, but we're happy to hear more about it. And then a couple of what we call items that give what you might call temporal flexibility or flexibility across time. So one of them, the idea of banking credits, another is borrowing credits in the future, and a third is that you just have a multi-year time period where you need to comply. So we'll talk a little bit more about those, but just to get started, those are the basic concepts that are in the discussion document. Next slide. So we also posed some specific questions to stakeholders. We asked specifically about the ACP option and whether we should include that. And we also asked about other flexibility components, such as multi-year compliance or credit banking, like I mentioned. Next slide. So we went into a little more detail in the stakeholder discussion document. And as many of you know, we also talked about this option a little bit in the virtual community meeting last week, because it may have equity implications. The alternative compliance payment option is basically that the supplier, the regulated entity, can make a payment in lieu of holding compliance credits. So they have a kind of an option. And when they do that, they are actually complying with the regulation. So that's not a penalty, it's an alternative way of complying with the regulation. And one of the things that does in a program like this, and many other programs have similar or identical mechanisms, is it puts an upper limit on how much compliance with the regulation might cost. So companies that are subject to the regulation can be sure, well, if I can't obtain the credits or do the clean heat I need to do, I can always make a payment in that amount. And that alternative compliance payment concept really raised the question of what would happen to those payments. And we raised a couple of concepts in the discussion document. One is using it to fund additional reductions in future years, and also in particular projects benefiting some of the entities that we identified as focus for equity consideration, low and middle income consumers, renters, and communities that suffer from poor air quality. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily now. Just briefly, as I said, reminder, sort of the plot here is when I'm speaking, I'm talking about things that the department has already said, or the climate plan or the Clean Heat Commission. When Emily speaks, she has kind of the tougher job because she's trying to summarize 300 pages of comment we got in just a few words, with the goal of helping to facilitate discussion. So we can certainly we hope to hear more on these topics at the meeting in the future. So I'll turn it over to Emily.
Sure, thanks, Will. So like Will mentioned, the alternative compliance payment mechanism is the one that we received the most comment on, and generally supportive of including this type of flexibility into the program. Commenters were also supportive specifically of compliance over multiple years, credit banking, Some commenters suggesting that there should be no limit on the amount of credits that could be banked or the number of years into the future in which they could be used. Also support for the transfer of the compliance obligation between entities and the inclusion of an emissions reduction fund were all things that commenters brought up specifically. If you want to go to the next slide. So in the comments, the benefits of including an alternative compliance payment mechanism included incentivizing electrification and supporting the obligated entities in their ability to comply. And then a few commenters pointed out some more specific benefits of an ACP, including preventing price volatility, strengthening program participation, and reducing illiquidity risk. There were some concerns. The most common concern raised was whether the cost of the ACP would be passed along to consumers. And a few commenters also raised that there could be issues with an oversupply of credits depressing prices or an undersupply of credits preventing obligated parties from meeting their obligation. Commenters also brought up what ACP payments might be used for. So one is bill relief for low and moderate income customers. That was supported by many commenters, along with generally for clean heat projects. A few commenters also pointed out there could be other financial or project support in LMI and environmental justice communities. And a few commenters thought that ACP could go towards research and development of new clean heat technologies. So with that, I will hand it back to Will for the next slide.
Great, thanks. So as I said, the primary thing we have in mind here is the alternative compliance payment has gotten the most attention, but we also have some other flexibility mechanisms. And one place to look for some more detailed discussion of those is the appendix to the climate plan that was written by the Regulatory Assistance Project in last year in the 2025 to 2030 climate plan. So they have some discussion in more detail about credit banking. And the idea there is if some entity has too many credits, they can bank those credits for a future year. And that banking has a couple of advantages. One obvious one is it encourages people to install clean heat early. So even if they meet the obligation in a certain year, they can still, it's still useful to keep generating clean heat and earn the credits, but it can also lower the cost of compliance because if you do incentivize that early action, it can make compliance in later years easier. There's also discussion about transferring among third parties. there's the transfer of credits, but there's also the possibility of transferring compliance obligations to other entities. One option that's brought up in that paper is the default delivery agent option, where there's basically a entity that's created to do creditable projects that you could use as a way of getting credits and transferring an obligation. And then also when we put out the reporting, a little bit off this slide, but when we put out the draft reporting requirements, we noted that there may be useful to be able to transfer a compliance obligation to larger entities that are higher on the distribution chain for the liquid fuels. So a couple of mechanisms that were discussed in that paper. Next slide.
Real quick, we have one comment in the chat from Caitlin Peel Sloan. Per the last community meeting I attended, I want to make sure DEP is accurately counting the number of organizations signed on to the comments we submitted, 36, which strongly supported an ACP and did not support banking or other flexibility.
That's helpful. And again, feel free to bring those sorts of things up. And I want to say we're not mostly in these slides for the next couple of days, we're not really noting so much things that were opposed in the comments, mostly because right now we're sort of trying to give a real close reading to all of the different options. So we will try and do our best, and you're welcome to add to it to reflect, make sure we capture what people supported. You may not see reflected in here cases where there's a lot of opposition. why don't we go on to the next slide, and then we have a question time, we can deal with other questions and concerns.
Next slide's up.
Oh, sorry, I meant Emily, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. I can jump in. So yes, just reiterating that this is really a high level overview of some of the positions taken in the comments and not any sort of real detailed quantification, but there was general support for compliance flexibility overall, along with credit banking and compliance via multiple technologies. There was less support, but still support for multi-year compliance periods, credit transfers, and credit borrowing. So I'll pass it back to Will for the next slide.
Great, thanks. So I think we're moving into the kind of questions and discussion phase. We were, as I said, certainly interested in, support and opposition and concern about these very mechanisms here. We also think that the spirit, these technical sessions were requested by stakeholders, and my supposition is that there's also some just kind of technical questions about what these things mean or how they can be done. And that's kind of what we're thinking is the first focus of these meetings, although I think we have time and interest in any other discussion that may be needed. We flagged a couple of things that we would be happy to learn more about. One, are there, and both of these are sort of in the same category. We want to make sure we're looking at sort of existing programs that exist elsewhere. For example, there's some programs discussed in our the technical memoranda that are posted on our webpage. Some of you are familiar with the Alternative Portfolio Standard program, California's Low Carbon Fuel Standard, that sort of thing. So we want to hear, in particular, are there mechanisms that we should be considering in the CHS, either what we've listed or we haven't, and also just the program in addition to the mechanisms. What are some good models we should be looking at? So that's it for the first portion of our presentation. And so I think we're now open for questions, comments, and discussion on particularly technical issues related to this topic, but also any more general discussion is fine.
Eladine?
Great, thank you. I had a question, and sorry if I missed more background on it, about the idea of transferring compliance obligations. And I was just wondering, does that mean literally that then somebody else would be responsible for providing the credits or the alternative compliance credits? And if so, would that alternative party be a regulated entity, like a utility? Like what would be the hook? I was just wondering if you could just talk more about that.
Yeah, that's one topic we haven't fleshed out too much, partly because we haven't seen too much interest thus far. But like as an example of that sort of thing, in the federal renewable fuel standard, there's the opportunity to voluntarily kind of assign your compliance obligation somewhere else in the supply chain. And so we're regulating, and this is less about the crediting part in this example, but regulating, for example, the companies that, or we expect to be regulating companies that deliver fuel to homes, but there might be options for some companies higher up in the distribution chain to sort of voluntarily take on that obligation. There also might be in the regulatory assistance appendix, there was this idea of a default delivery agent that was somehow in charge of or created for the purpose of doing clean heat. And there might be some legal mechanism by which it's not that different from an alternative compliance payment, but for a payment that that entity would become obligated under the program, particularly for smaller entities. I should say, though, that's not something we have given a lot of thought to so far. So if that's of particular interest to stakeholders, we're happy to hear more technical comments on it.
There is a comment in the chat from Caitlin Fields Sloan that we support a default delivery agent and obligation transfer credit flexibility. So we
Great,
did
thanks.
One thing in the chat.
Other questions and comments? We had a request for some technical sessions on these topics, so we're thinking people have some particular topics to forward. Pause a little more. Also clarify, even though I have emphasized technical questions, we are happy to take, questions or comments on anything I presented thus far in this presentation.
Comment from Audrey Horst, small mom and pop businesses, how will the program work?
Interesting question. Mom and pop businesses would generally not be regulated. I'm hesitant to adopt the term. There are some small businesses that, as heating oil suppliers, maybe have a compliance obligation. And then hopefully, for businesses that have facilities that are heated, they'll have the opportunity to earn credits when they implement clean heat measures. We do also expect that there will be some cost of the program embedded in the purchase of the energy as we implement the program.
Chris Brennan, Ideal Energy Cooperative. I understand this first technical sessions for stakeholders are overviews of comments and gathering of good ideas phase. So this question may be premature. When will the technical sessions address the calculation or formula of an ACP? If we assume that most obligated parties will pass on the ACP cost to consumers one way or another, what money level range is MassDEP looking for, if any? Thank you.
So maybe we should move on to the second part of the session, because we actually broke this at the request of commenters into two parts. One was in general talking about flexibility mechanism, and then I think because the commenters recognized that's such a discrete question, a second topic was how would we set the amount of the ACP? So I think maybe it's a good time to go through the rest of those slides now, and we can always circle back to any other questions people had. But I certainly not, for us, it's not premature to hear, have forwarded any of the issues that we think should be talking about, any thoughts about them. So why don't we go through the rest of the slides and then we can come back to that question. So as a reminder, we thought we might, we're a little bit ahead of schedule now, but this may be useful if we have more questions about the second part. So the first part was generally about compliance mechanism and alternative compliance payments. And the request we got for technical sessions suggested setting the level was potentially a separate and discrete topic, and we thought that made sense. So we're moving on to that topic now for the last part of the meeting. So I'll go ahead and present that material now. Next slide. So the question that was just asked about was about setting the alternative compliance payment level, and one of the places where the concepts that are at play there was presented most clearly was in the Clean Heat Commission final report. You want to set a price to make sure that you're not sort of competing with credit creation. So you need to have an ACP price that's high enough to make sure that it's preferable to do clean heat rather than just making the payment. So that's kind of the reason that you would want to set it higher. On the other hand, It is true that there are payments involved, so that's a cost burden. So you don't want to have too large an ACP amount that you unduly burden businesses, ratepayers, or others that may be affected by it. So that's kind of the balancing act there. We would also need to make up the, I'll call it, term of compliance level, with reference to something, and a couple of references that have been considered are with reference to the social cost of carbon. So that's a kind of a dollar amount that's associated with the value of presenting a certain amount of emissions. So you might think about that when you set an alternative compliance payment. The other reference we talked about is technology costs. And we gave the example there that the MassSave program has already established rebate amounts for a lot of the technology we're talking about. And the one of particular interest is the conversion of a home to a fully electrified home. And that's eligible for a rebate of $10,000. So you might have, think about that when you're setting an alternative compliance payment, where some that would be somehow translated into whatever the way the clean heat standard is operated to inform what a alternative compliance payment amount might be. Next slide. So we also, asked this question specifically in the stakeholder discussion document. How should we set the level? Next slide. So of course we got some responses. I'm going to turn it over to Emily to talk through those.
Yes, so we got a lot of general support for the ACP, and then a few commenters had real specific ideas about this. So in terms of setting the level of the ACP, so how much an ACP would be worth, a few commenters suggested that it should increase over time each year. Some suggested that it should be complemented by a price floor to protect program stability, again, because an ACP is sort of a price ceiling. And then a few mentioned the need to be sure to set the price carefully to the ACP level. In terms of how the ACP might relate to existing programs, many commenters suggested that matching the MassSave incentive dollar amounts may not be the best way to do it. And a few commenters suggested that aligning with the social cost of carbon would be a good approach. There were other considerations that stakeholders asked we consider in program design. So making sure that we incentivize electrification of a home, incentivizing heat pump adoption, particularly at the scale that will meet the emissions targets set in the clean energy and climate plans, encouraging decarbonization, preventing price spikes, and preventing depressed credit prices, so preventing the prices from falling too low. And I think that's it for this slide.
Great, thanks. So just to guide conversation here, similar questions to which we mentioned before. What is there in the existing programs that are out there? We don't necessarily like to reinvent the wheel when we have good solutions to draw on and experience. So we're happy to hear about that sort of thing. And then what else should we consider? So that kind of kicks off the second part of the discussion, which, as I said, can go back to the first part. And I would just point out, in relation to the way the question was posed a minute ago, we're not ourselves, we have some work to do before we can sort of float a real technical kind of a framework that answers some of these questions, and some of that will be internal and some of that with stakeholders. But we think there's a lot of people that have already done a lot of thinking about that. So we don't want to discourage people. There's no issue that's too technical for people to bring up at this meeting. It's just that we're not ready to speak to every issue now. So in that spirit, Josh, I thought I'm going to ask you to just reread the question that I kind of moved past just before this, just to see whether we've covered it or whether there's anything there that I should say a little more about.
Sure. Chris Brennan, Ideal Energy Cooperative. I understand this first technical sessions for stakeholders are overviews of comments and gathering of good ideas phase. So this question may be premature. When will the technical sessions address the calculation or formula of an ACP? If we assume that most obligated parties will pass on the ACP cost to consumers one way or another, what money level is MassDEP looking for, if any? Thank you.
Yeah, so I addressed some of the ways we might set the ACP amount earlier, and I probably don't have too much more to add at this point, but to the extent that stakeholders, do have come into this with ideas about that, we are happy to hear from them or discuss them more at this meeting. And just do a quick reminder also that we have asked for sort of another round of comments if you're attending these meetings and thinking, either maybe what you had said before needs some additional detail or you have new ideas. We're happy to continue receiving those, and preferably before the end of August, but at any time.
I see a comment from Senator Mike Barrett, and let me just respond to this and I can turn it to Will for more details. The comment is to expand on the matter of impacts on small businesses. Can you expand on the issue of how small heating oil or propane suppliers should master the details of complying? So the answer to that, and what's bringing this up for me, is I think our homework from this conversation today is to come up with some more details on how we see what the compliance path is, how they would comply based on how much fuel they're selling, and how would they comply with an ACP versus providing clean heat options. But what DEP normally does in our regulatory processes is we do work with our regulated entities. We provide guidance. You see that in some of our other climate programs on exactly how regulated entities need to comply. So that is one of our homework things to think about, of how we can better explain this so that small companies and other companies will have a better understanding of what they need to do. In terms of those companies that are you're talking about heavily regulated, many of them do have reporting requirements. We've been doing a lot of digging into that, and I'll ask Will to expand on that part of it.
Yeah, as you may know, we published what might be needed as far as specific reporting for this program earlier this year in quite a bit of detail, and had a round of opportunity for stakeholder comment on that. So that gives some idea as far as the reporting requirement. I think as far as the compliance obligation, I think that there's a lot of experience in markets like this that there are entities that will enter a market and help make credits available for any entity that needs them. Companies, no matter how big or small, if they're working in the heating oil business, are used to sort of buying and selling things that may vary in price. So they may be able to participate in that. I think that's also one of the reasons we raised a couple of other things. One is this idea of the default delivery agent. So it's a little bit different than an alternative compliance payment, in that it's sort of a company that company isn't the right word, but an entity that for payment could sort of do the compliance with credits on your behalf, would be one way of looking at that. So I think that's the basic concepts we have there. Oh, sorry. And then the other thing that I mentioned earlier is when we followed the draft reporting requirements, we did discuss the idea that there may be, when smaller companies buy, pretty much anything that has some compliance obligation, but particularly fuels and chemicals, the companies they're buying from them may do some help with the compliance part of it. So we floated the idea that we would want to make sure that if there are ways that we could set up the program so that the larger wholesalers might, handle the credit obligation, kind of on behalf of the smaller companies, that might help. And that's kind of one of the flexibility options that we're thinking of. But we do also, recognize we have some work to do there, and we have a lot of experience in regulating small businesses. But we're going to keep our eye on this issue, certainly, and keep looking for ideas, and we're open for thoughts on this for sure.
Comment from Caitlin Peel Sloan of CLF. MassSave data is a good starting point, but the record of performance does not indicate that $10,000 is sufficient to drive whole house conversions at the scale we need.
Great, that's helpful, and I guess I would use that as a time to point out, you know, that's exactly what we're here for, is that's for the comment, so that's good to know. And groups can, you know, I guess the thing I wanted to say is we will take that as a comment from this meeting, but to the extent, you know, you're listening to these meetings and you find things you really think you need to emphasize, we're happy to receive additional written comments also.
Kyle Murray, I've asked you to unmute.
Great, thank you. I also want to second Caitlin's comment about the $10,000 figure not being sufficient. But I also had a question about, you know, you mentioned potentially utilizing a social cost of carbon. Which figure of social cost of carbon would we be using on that? Because there's a federal number, there's the AES avoided energy supply cost number from 2021, I think it was. And then there was an updated figure that the AESC had as well. And I know there's a new AESC study, I think, that's going on right now too, to be completed in 2024. So that could utilize a completely different social cost of carbon. So I'm just curious, what would be the process, you know, for picking which one of those?
Hey, Kyle, before we answer, do you have a preference about what we talked about earlier, setting a dollar amount related? We put out an example as MassSave, or are you advocating not to use social cost of carbon? And if you don't have an answer, that's fine. I'm just curious. Kyle.
Sorry, I muted myself after my comment, just, you know,
Okay.
best Zoom practice, and I couldn't unmute. I don't have a specific figure in mind at the moment. I would have to look into that. I do think using the strongest social cost of carbon possible would be the best practice if we're going to use social cost of carbon, just because that, you know, does tend to be the figure that best represents you know, the overall impacts. So no specific figure right now.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, that's very helpful.
Next comment from Cole Martin, Argus Media. Thanks for organizing these sessions and providing context on potential program design. Just wanting to confirm, are there any updates at this time on when DEP expects to finalize regulations and when DEP expects to have the program up and running?
So I'll take this one. I think we'll go back to what it said in the CECP, which was to start the program as early as calendar year 2024. That still stands. You know, there was as early as means as early as, but I think DEP is committed to making sure we do the right amount of stakeholder involvement. We are doing these 3 technical sessions. We're doing virtual community meetings every 4 to 6 weeks that we talked about last week. And we hope to put out a straw document. I think what we said was in the August timeframe. And this is a complex policy, so I think the only information we can say right now is that it will begin as early as 2024, and we will continue to provide updates, but that's about as much as I can say right now.
Joe Uglieto, DES. You cited that MassSave established $10,000 as an appropriate incentive to fully electrify a home. What was their assumption for the cost to fully electrify a home in Massachusetts? What cost will the DEP use when establishing the ACP price?
Yeah, I certainly don't have the sort of numerical answer to that off the top of my head, but I think we were more referencing it as a case where there's been a regulatory decision about what the might amount of incentive needed might be. There's also a on the website, there's a technical paper that does list some potential cost assumptions. So we would also be potentially referring to that and other sources, but I think that's exactly the kind of thing we're happy, and we already heard some of it a minute ago, to receive, detailed input on. We think there's a lot of stakeholders that are already given quite a bit of thought to that kind of question, and we're happy to have that, now or in writing at any time.
Michael Ferrante, when you finally determine the social cost of carbon number, will MassDEP score the electric grid?
So I think I'm going to dodge that one a little bit, because the next session we have is on how we would calculate credits, and unless I'm missing something, I don't quite see how that's related to the social cost of carbon part of it, unless you want to clarify, but we want to kind of keep the sessions a little bit separate. So just as a reminder, we have a couple other sessions scheduled for this week. One of them is about how to calculate credits in general, and then also about how to calculate credits for hybrid systems that include a fossil and electric component, and the question of dealing with electricity, maybe of particular of interest in that session. And then another one about MassSave and measure verification on Wednesday.
Caitlin Peel Sloan, CLF. Remember that meeting the 2030 and 2050 emission limits for buildings is not MassSave's mission, and they have taken a conservative approach towards those incentives.
Right. One of the things that we have flagged about the clean heat standard is that it does, as it is a standard, it does provide a method for really tracking and holding the state, responsible for progress in a way that some other programs don't. So that's a helpful reminder, Caitlin.
Joe, I've asked you to unmute.
Yes, I was curious, the DEP hasn't given any indication on their thought process of where the ACP might be in order to kind of inform stakeholders and better allow us to comment on the ACP level. Could you give us an idea of where you're thinking the ACP might be priced?
Well, I can just do a little maybe more thorough job of explaining what we've already kind of floated. One, when we say with reference to, we might set it with reference to the MassSave program providing $10,000 for a heat pump. What that means is that we haven't really figured out the details of this, but a compliance entity would be, the payment amount. So at some point we'll have to figure out sort of how many credits a heat pump conversion is worth exactly, and that sort of thing. But the consequence of, each additional heat pump that you don't complete, or a credit that you don't earn for a heat pump installation, would trigger an alternative compliance payment, either at the time or maybe spread out over a number of years, equivalent to that number. And we've, if you were to reference the MassSave incentives, it would be $10,000. So that's one category. The other category is you may have a situation where your credits you earn, and we would come up with some default numbers most likely or something, but we're more specifically associated not with the installation of a heat pump, but with reduction in emissions. So in that case, there would be some numerical reduction in emissions, thinking of a heat pump. If you know the amount of emissions in a particular year from a particular home, say, the social cost of carbon means how much value there is to avoiding those emissions in dollars, and it's in dollars per metric ton of emissions. So we would in that theory sort of make the alternative compliance payment so that you would need to maybe spend up to that amount to make the reductions, but if the reduction couldn't be done for that amount, then you would be allowed to make that payment.
Right now, how you score electricity would directly impact where you set the ACP price. So if you give electricity or the electric grid a carbon neutral score, that would make the ACP price, X. But if you set the electric grid as a 0 carbon intensity, you'd generate, 4 or 5X the amount of credits, and the ACP price could be, 5X what it would be depending on how you score electricity. So, I guess, are all those things being considered? And, when we talk about the social cost of carbon, the Biden administration originally set it at $51. Other programs have set it in the 200s. And you've seen some programs set it as low as $10. So, I mean, when we're talking about multiples off, in order for me to submit comments, I'd submit much different comments if you're going to set, the ACP at $10 versus a different price. So, I mean, have you given a lot of thoughts to that, and are you willing to at least give some kind of idea of what price you're thinking of?
Yeah, that's very helpful. So first of all, I should just say that as far as next steps, we've already signaled that we think a next step that we need to do at some point is put out something that looks more like a straw framework. So that gives you some actual, what our thinking is to react to. And we haven't done, I think we did some of that in the discussion document, but we haven't done much of that. And that would come later in the fall. But I also want to acknowledge I didn't, and apologize to the earlier question. I didn't quite catch what the electricity connection was. I think the answer to your question, Joe, is we've been thinking of it a little differently. And maybe the example I should have given was if you have a home that switches to from oil heat to electricity, say, or gas heat to electricity, then the first thing we have to do is figure out how much emission reductions, or depending on how we go at it, we may need to figure out how much emission reductions happen. And that's the point where we need to figure out whether we're sort of scoring electricity or not. And that's kind of the topic that comes, tomorrow. But if we're scoring electricity, then, you're right to point out that my example wasn't very good, in the sense that if you're changing from oil to electricity, and electricity is assumed to have some emissions, then you would subtract those to get the amount of emission reductions, and then that would be what would be associated with the social cost of carbon. Does that help, Joe? I think that your question definitely clarified what you were asking.
Yeah, that's correct. Just for when stakeholders comment, and I know you mentioned you might release some thought process in the fall, but I'm sure internally it's been discussed of where to set the ACP. And you mentioned, looking at other programs as models, looking at the LCFS in California, Washington, and Oregon, they've set the ACP level and the social cost of carbon in their programs. A number of RPS programs have set the APS program at certain levels, and those are very different levels. So, I mean, if you could give us some type of idea of your thought process, with numbers, it would, I think, help frame comments from all stakeholders here, because it's hard to comment when we have no idea what your thought process is.
Yeah, I think we might not be as far along as you're sort of assuming we are. We really are just trying to get what stakeholders have already thought about this. So if you have thoughts at this point, you're welcome to share this, but there certainly will be share them with us at any time. We heard one about making sure we set it high enough. We're happy to hear, thoughts, however they're framed, about this at any time. And I probably, to complete the thought, I think we also are uncertain of whether it helps to get some of the concepts clarified before you get to too much details and numbers. And the idea of a kind of a technology-based incentive, like under MassDEP, that sort of doesn't have as much demand or depend on much as what the social cost of carbon is. So we've floated the idea that we might set an ACP that wasn't even connected to the social cost of carbon, but instead was connected, for example, to how much is the estimate of how much the cost is of actually making the changes that would be needed to make the conversion. And usually when prices like this are set, it's sort of a combination of both those things, because you do need to set, you know, if you know what the transition is, you need to set it at a high enough level to make sure that the transition occurs. So
Right.
maybe that was a little bit of the thought process.
Okay, yeah, and you mentioned a lot incentivizing air source heat pumps to levels that would incentivize homeowners to convert to heat pumps. You hadn't mentioned considering all of the obligated technologies like propane, heating oil, and natural gas. What a specific ACP price might do to the cost of that fuel, depending on what level you set it at. You could be talking about adding $1 or $2 to every gallon of heating oil or propane or the thermic natural gas. Has that been taken into consideration? Would that be taken into consideration? How much of an impact that'll have on homeowners?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we had in the comments that we shared the comment about concerns about ACP or credit costs are passed on to consumers, and we've asked a question in the discussion document about how we might approach an additional economic analysis on that issue, particularly with regard to income challenged kind of customers, low income customers. So that's very much something we do intend to do once we understand the program a little better, but we don't quite have the moving parts in place at this point.
Okay, yeah, my request would be that as soon as internally you come up with a number that makes sense to release it to stakeholders, because until that number is released, we won't know what kind of impact this program will have on consumers, negative or positive.
Right. The only thing I will say as a complication there is that there's a lot of experience, and partly this is the purpose of market-based programs, is to look for the least expensive compliance options. So we won't, know for sure. We can have a hypothetical based on the ACP amount, but there are complications into sort of doing that type of analysis, but that's one of the reasons we have those technical memos that we've already put out, is to sort of put down some technical basis for some of that analysis. Right.
I think when you set obligation levels like have been discussed in the discussion document to 29% reduction from 1990 levels by 2025, 49% reduction levels by 2030 from 1990 levels by 2030. I think you're setting up a program that's going to be perpetually undersupplied. So when you set the ACP level, that's vital, because all credits will trade at the ACP, and there'll be a number of ACP payments in every compliance period. So the ACP price will be the price that's priced into all fuel, all obligated fuel, so all fossil fuel obligations. So that is why the ACP is so important, because the way it appears this program is going to be designed, it's going to be undersupplied in every compliance period.
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable way to put it. I think, but I want to caveat that we haven't made decisions about compliance obligations in any particular year, but the general observation I think is well taken. So thank you.
Thanks.
Kyle?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on the scoring electricity part of things, in that, just note that we already do that through a number of programs. We have the renewable portfolio standard, we have the regional greenhouse gas initiative. So, the carbon intensity in the electricity market is already factored in there. So I'm not sure we need to do that in the in this, in terms of like factor in a negative from fossil fuel emissions in the electric sector, because we're already doing that in the generation market.
Great. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to speak to that issue today because of tomorrow's agenda, but that's helpful to have that comment.
Senator Mike Barrett, the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard aims in part to prompt electric companies to switch to cleaner sources of supply, something they're able to do while remaining electric companies. What's the theory of the clean heat standard? Is it meant to incentivize heating oil and propane fuel companies to switch the fuels they supply while remaining fuel companies? And if so, what are the alternative fuels they might supply while remaining in business? And if the aim is not to have them switch to supplying cleaner fuels, into what broader alternative services might they transition to supplying?
So I think we're coming at the question from a little different direction. I certainly hear the question, but we are looking at this something that implements the clean energy and climate plans that have been published by the state that identify electrification as a key strategy toward getting toward 2050 and set particular rates of progress that really, according to the climate plan modeling, need to be achieved to get where we need to get to. So we're very much focused on that. As you know, there are some companies that would be regulated on this that also are involved in the installation of heat pumps. So that would be one example. And then we we'll talk about a little bit more tomorrow, but there may also be some liquid fuels or maybe a variety of liquid fuels that qualify and are creditable under the standard, particularly in the short term as the transition to electrification occurs. We haven't made decisions either way on that topic, and it's very much a topic for stakeholder input. We have lots of written comment on it. It's not something we're going to kind of resolve in the technical session. It's something we'll have to get to in the framework later on.
I'm not seeing any other hands or comments at this time. Brian Davidson, with the R&D being done by heating oil OEMs to bring to market high efficiency equipment that runs on higher blends of renewable biofuels, B100 oil burners are now commercially available. For example, will there be incentives to transition homes to higher blends of low carbon liquid fuels?
Yes, I think the basic design certainly allows for that. I can't predict the outcome of the program, partly because we received a lot of comments on sort of both sides of the question of what should count other than electricity, and we have a lot of internal work to deal with on that. As I said, we are certainly open for comment anytime if there's particular things that people think we should know about that maybe we don't. And I guess I should also caveat, I know that we took a little bit of we don't want to give them a wrong impression by the summaries of the comments we've given today. We certainly have read, multiple people have read all the comments and we're considering them carefully in detail. We just wanted to give some flavor. So I don't have a specific reaction or answer to that, but that's certainly one of the questions we have open at this point.
I'm not seeing any other comments or hands right now.
All right, maybe we're all set. Christine, what do you think? I will just say, if we stop now and you think of other questions, we have 2 more technical sessions that are particularly, I think Wednesday's agenda is likely to have some time in it for additional questions about any of the topics. So you can keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's right. Can you just go to the last slide, please? So you'll see the two sessions tomorrow and Wednesday. So we certainly encourage you folks to weigh in. As we see, there are a lot of intricacies and complexities to this program. So getting your comments is incredibly important. And then the next slide, please. So, and just again, we say this at every meeting. We have a web page that's set up, has lots of information there. We're taking comments as we go through this. Our email box is right there too. And then we are encouraging folks to sign up for our email list. If you know people that might be interested and are not signed up yet, please forward information to them or let us know who you might think would be good recipients to be on the email list. So the more people we have that are participating in the stakeholder process, we think we'll end up in a better place in terms of policy going forward. So with that, I see another question in the chat, Josh. Okay, I see a suggestion. Once we get the framework, consider technical sessions like DPU does with multiple dueling expert presentations. So that sounds interesting. So we'll take a look at that model. And with that, I think we are ready to wrap up and we will be back again tomorrow.
All right, thank you, everybody.